So the 21st century, on the one hand, focuses on peacekeeping and peacemaking.
The spread of poverty, massive population increases, continuing environmental decay, the spread of diseases.
I don't know of any other organization in the world that is asked to do so much with so little.
I wouldn't exactly cry buckets of tears if the UN went out of business.
This week, CNN presents The Next 50 Years, the UN at War and Peace.
Bogged down in Bosnia, chased out of Somalia, helpless bystander to the bloodbath of Rwanda. Daily images of failure that cloud a half-century of much success. It's no wonder disunity swirls around the United Nations as we mark its 50th birthday this month. Hello, I'm Bernard Shaw. Welcome to a special 2-hour CNN Presents, The Next 50 Years, the UN at War and Peace. It was born from the ashes of a world war. The dream, united, the nations of the world could end bloodshed. Today, the face of the enemy has changed. It is the gaunt face of famine, the exhausted face of the refugee, the hardened face of ethnic hatred. It's an enemy that slips across borders, a people boom, a polluted planet, a rash of infectious disease. How successful can the UN be when the enemy comes from east and west, south and north? This week, some lessons for its next 50 years. A tale of two nations in turmoil, Mozambique in southern Africa, where the UN is helping rebuild one of the poorest countries on earth, and Bosnia, a European landmine, where UN peacekeepers took on a mission impossible. Senior international correspondent Christiane Amanpour begins with the UN at war.
I can't forget, because everything what you survive, you must remember.
Husband, mother, brother, everyone, friends, cousins.
Is the war in Bosnia the war of the future? And if so, will the United Nations do better next time?
I think there are many lessons to be learned from Bosnia. I think the first lesson to be learned is what is your aim when you go in?
Instead, Bosnia became a metaphor for muddling through.
We reached a checkpoint, and according to the folks at the checkpoint, we don't have authorization to move beyond here.
UN peacekeepers were thrown in to deliver humanitarian aid, food, medicine, shelter. It looked as though the world was taking action.
It made a lot of people all over the world feel that at least something is done to the most vulnerable people. And this feeling was maybe prolong the war.
There are whole families up here that have been massacred. I'd like to know who's done it.
What is the UN's proper role when neighbors slaughter neighbors because of their religious or ethnic background? Those who will guide the United Nations into the future are looking here for answers. From the experience of Bosnia, they are trying to find a new model for peacekeeping. Something between being lightly armed, impartial observers and going to war. General Michael Rose commanded UN troops in Bosnia in 1994.
If the world wants to go to war for moral reasons, then it must take that decision knowingly. What it can't do is use a peacekeeping force to prosecute warfighting measures, however strong the moral outrage may be about what's happening on the ground.
Moral outrage brought the Blue Helmets to Bosnia, but was UN peacekeeping the right tool when there was no peace to keep?
There were only two other options. One, to stay out altogether, which was publicly unacceptable, or two, to send a military expeditionary force under the aegis of NATO, for which there was no political will. So by default, the UN was pushed into Bosnia.
Bosnia, before the war, part of communist Yugoslavia. For 50 years, Muslims, Serbs, and Croats lived peacefully there. But Yugoslavia began to come apart in 1991 as politicians played for power and preyed on people's fears. When the Serbs in Bosnia decided to carve out their own independent state, it triggered Europe's worst conflict since World War II. The international community labeled the Muslims the main victims, the Serbs the principal aggressors. The Serbs had the upper hand because they had the big guns when the UN imposed an arms embargo on the region. They shelled cities, destroyed villages, and used rape as a weapon of terror.
One beats you from this side, another from this side, a third from this side, while one is doing his job on you.
The purpose of this war has been to move people. Ethnic cleansing, as it became known, is part of the warring.
And UN troops delivering humanitarian aid became prisoners of war. The Bosnian Serb army, led by General Ratko Mladic, blocked UN convoys.
Start turning around, so turn it around, marshal it, start working your way back.
Stole UN weapons and vehicles, and eventually even held peacekeepers as human shields.
In peacekeeping or peacemaking, in every confrontation there, it's a confrontation between two wills. I repeat, today, Mladic is strong just through our own weakness.
In 1993, General Philippe Morillon went to the town of Srebrenica, where thousands of desperate Muslims were trapped. Serbs were shelling it and stopping food convoys. Morillon defiantly raised the UN flag and promised not to leave until aid was delivered.
You are now under the protection of the UN forces.
In the future, says Morillon, the UN should not have to back down trying to fulfill a mandate, such as delivering humanitarian aid.
See the opponent and tell him, I have been given the order to go there. In half an hour, I will start my mission, and just shoot at me if you dare. Shoot at me if you dare. But if you have the armored helicopters, if you have the airplanes flying there, if you have the heavy artillery, nobody will never shoot at you.
But for the first 3 years in Bosnia, UN generals rarely used force. They didn't have enough hardware or the political will from world leaders. That was obvious after Morillon's visit to Srebrenica. The UN declared it and 5 other besieged Muslim towns safe areas. 2 years later, Srebrenica and Zepa fell to the Serbs, and UN troops no longer patrol Gorazde.
Those nations which voted yes to safe havens did not vote yes to sending along troops. And the tragedy was that the United Nations then didn't say to the people of Zepa, Srebrenica and Gorazde, you now live in highly unsafe havens, because we haven't got the resources to make them safe.
The decision late August to use NATO planes and UN ground troops to enforce the UN mission marked a turning point in Bosnia's war. But by then, this UN member state was well on the way to being dismembered along ethnic lines on the UN's watch. For those who dreamed of a United Nations that would stand up to aggression, the force was welcome, but it came too late. What will the UN do next time? General Morillon says upholding the UN's principles has a price.
Our soldiers are not paid only to kill. It's not admissible for civilization that we can have soldiers ready to kill but not ready to die.
But, warns General Rose, governments draw a line between the UN's principles and their own national interests.
And what they cannot accept, and no government could accept, is their brave young men and women who have gone to be peacekeepers coming back in body bags because the mandate has been turned from one of peacekeeping into one of war fighting.
is something between peacekeeping and war fighting, it may be difficult to find until countries decide how much they want to risk for the UN's 50-year promise of collective security and whether they can afford not to.
February 4th, 1995.
Ludnica. Ludnica. It means madhouse. The opening word to the diary of a Muslim girl reflects the insanity of Bosnia's human tidal wave. Nearly 3 million refugees, Muslims, Serbs, and Croats, have stretched UN relief agencies to the breaking point. Around the world, ethnic and religious wars uproot hundreds of thousands more each year.
Today is a special day in my life, not only because I'm starting this diary, but also because today I start to live. Today is my first day of freedom. Today, I left hell.
18-year-old Renata Memic fled with her family from their hometown of Prijedor in northern Bosnia in February 1995. They found their way to the Gasinci refugee camp in Croatia. Run by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, it is one of a kind. There are recreational activities, jobs to keep people busy and put a little money in their pockets. Even a mosque for the faithful. But the existence of this showcase institution is itself a sore point for the UN, a constant reminder that it inadvertently helped achieve the goal of ethnic purity by helping persecuted civilians escape.
The victims will come to our field staff and say, help us get out of the place because we don't think we can survive anymore. To help them means you are going to help ethnic cleansing, isn't it? And then to not help them means that these people may be killed.
In Bosnia, Renata's father, Adnan, had been a metal worker. He now works a couple of hours a day at the refugee center doing maintenance work. Her mother, Mary, looks after the two-room shelter they share with another family. Their story is a chronicle of a war against civilians, the kind of war the UN is increasingly asked to clean up.
What?
Renata remembers how life used to be.
In my school, we had all kinds of people. Muslims, Catholics, Serbs. We got along great. It didn't matter which group you were from.
When Serb militias took control of her town, life suddenly changed for the Muslims and Croats.
We were all fired from our jobs, the Muslims and Croats. I'd held the same job for 19 years, and suddenly fired for no reason. Just because we're Muslims, that's the only reason.
The teachers at school were spouting this bullshit. One was always trying to brainwash us. In class one day I asked, what did the Muslims of Prijedor ever do to hurt the Serbs? It was brave, but stupid. I was scared I'd get into a lot of trouble, but I got away with it.
Vi se sjećate kad su bila ona ubistva, masovna ubistva u Prijedoru?
You remember when there were mass murders in Prijedor? Near our house, they killed one family. We heard everything, but we couldn't help them, couldn't even leave our house. We heard them crying, begging for help. We could see their house burning. And the next night, a van full of men stopped in front of our house. They wanted to kill us.
To leave Prijedor, there were formalities. The Serbs wanted it to look legal.
In City Hall, you fill out an application to leave. City Hall sends a representative to your house who makes an inventory of everything, all your property. and either they assign someone to move into the house, or I choose someone. Then at City Hall, you sign everything over to that person.
But that's only the first step. For a bus ride to the border, each had to pay $300. The Memic family didn't have enough. There was an agonizing choice: who to leave behind.
It was all a question of money, how much money we would scrape together, whether it would be enough money for everyone. In the end, we decided that my dad would stay behind. It was his wish. He wanted us to get out of there. He told us, I'm an old man, I'm retired, I've lived my life. You kids, you have to go, you have to live.
In the stack of old family photos, his picture reminds them of a painful goodbye.
I couldn't look him in the eye because he was crying. He walked out with us when we left, and he cried. I was not used to seeing him like that. I'd never seen him cry in my life. Never.
UN relief workers know that most of the world's 20 million refugees face bleak futures. Immigration laws are getting tougher, and the doors of wealthy countries are closed to all but a lucky few. On this day, the Memic's youngest daughter has good news. They can come to Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. It's a new beginning in the United States, but not the end of this story. What happened here will take generations to heal.
I'm not ashamed to say I was a child, full of foolish views on life. Who could have imagined that yesterday's friends would raise a voice and even a hand to you? People with whom you grew up, lived, ate, drank, shared happiness and tears. People you fell in love with. And because of jealousy or some other reason, they would hate you so much. Why such hatred? Why?
Later in this program, success in the world's poorest nation. After 15 years of war, how the UN is making it safer for refugees to come home again.
The mines, which cost less than 50 cents to lay, cost as much as $4,000 each to remove. They are destroyed where they are found.
The most serious forms of murder, killings, mass raping of women and men, torturing people.
Europe in the 1990s. An echo of Europe in the 1940s.
Mass slaughter of whole groups of people because of their religion, because of their race.
After World War II, the Allies established the Nuremberg trials to prosecute Nazis for genocide.
The charges we have brought accuse the defendants of having committed crimes against humanity.
Nuremberg prosecutor Ben Ferencz hoped these trials would set a precedent and prevent future war crimes, but they didn't.
There have been mass rapes, genocides committed all over the world since Nuremberg, and the international community has done nothing but wring their hands.
Now, for the first time in the 50 years since Nuremberg, the international community is actually going to apply the lessons it learned there. Here, in this courtroom in The Hague, accused war criminals will answer for what they did in the former Yugoslavia. And the outcome could have enormous implications for the future, for the ability to enforce international law and human rights, which is, after all, what the United Nations is all about. But the trials may be at risk even before they begin.
Well, this is the Deputy Prosecutor's office through there.
Chief Prosecutor Richard Goldstone says the tribunal doesn't have enough money to conduct important investigations. And it's likely People most responsible for the atrocities in former Yugoslavia will never be brought to justice.
The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is now in session.
The tribunal was established by the Security Council in 1993. So far, 43 people have been indicted.
For the record, would you state your full name?
Moje puno ime I prezime Duško Tadić.
But only this man, Dusan Tadić, is in custody. An 18-page indictment charges him with crimes against humanity, rape, murder, and torture. Most of the crimes allegedly took place at a Serb-run camp called Omarska, where thousands of Bosnian Muslims and Croats were imprisoned. They were served starvation rations once a day, brutally beaten, and sometimes killed. Muharrem Besic survived Omarska. Today, he spends much of his time at his cousin's cafe in Germany, a gathering place for Bosnian refugees. Besic says he often saw Dusan Tadić at the camp and once heard him force prisoners to sexually mutilate each other.
It was clear. We all heard it when he gave the commands, when he shouted, "Bite off his testicles."
How do you plead to the indictment, guilty or not guilty?
Tadic's trial is expected to begin within weeks. He has denied all charges and says he wasn't even at Omarska. But Besic has no doubts.
Dusan Tadić went to primary school with me. His house was only about 1 kilometer away from mine, so I knew him.
Besic's cousin Hussein helped German authorities track down Tadić after Muslim refugees spotted him in Munich. It was a lucky break. Most suspects are still in Bosnia. Some factional leaders refuse to hand them over because they don't recognize the tribunal's jurisdiction. So these cells remain empty because the tribunal has no power to arrest.
Clearly, this tribunal has to rely on the cooperation of national states. No international court can be given or will be given its own police force or army in order to enable it to invade sovereign states and arrest people.
In the great drive through the heart of Germany,
50 years ago, things were different.
German generals were captured by American troops.
Germany surrendered unconditionally. The occupying powers were the reigning government. They could direct the police what to do. They could move in with their own police.
Now war crimes investigating officers sift the evidence.
And Nuremberg prosecutors had another advantage. The Nazis documented their crimes meticulously.
They mimeographed 100 copies describing exactly which units had killed how many people, at which days, and where.
Today's tribunal doesn't have a paper trail to follow.
We're going to have to rely more on eyewitnesses to say what happened. It means the job is more difficult. Certainly it doesn't mean the job can't be done, and it certainly doesn't mean that the job isn't being done.
But some fear justice will never be served, especially in the cases of the Bosnian Serb leaders, Radovan Karadzic and General Ratko Mladic. Both have been indicted on charges of genocide and crimes against humanity. Both scoff at the charges. Mladic even says he did his duty.
I protected my people. Only they can judge me. There is no bigger glory than to protect my own people.
I have no doubt, and I've said it on a number of occasions, that our primary purpose is to go against the people who are most guilty. And the people who are most guilty are the people at the top of the ladder of command.
But in exchange for a negotiated peace settlement in Bosnia, some fear the UN Security Council might give them amnesty. Goldstone says that would be unacceptable.
The fundamental significance is that there's only one way to stop criminal conduct, whether in a national state or in the international arena, and that is to make would-be criminals fear arrest and punishment.
Human rights advocates say the stakes are high. They hope this tribunal will lead to a permanent international criminal court.
If it succeeds, it will say that there's a place in the international arena for justice. And that, of course, would be a very important new development. We've never had international justice.
Ferenc, who saw the horrors of what the Nazis had done, believes accountability is long overdue.
What kind of a world do we want? Do we want a world where people can commit mass rapes and plan it as part of a governmental program, can commit genocide and crimes against humanity and escape any trial? If that's the kind of a world you want, you've got it. Do nothing. Go back and watch the O.J. Simpson trial or watch the ball game. Never again meant never again, no matter where it takes place.
When we come back, how the United Nations is waging economic war in Serbia. And later, across the world, how the UN is waging economic peace in Mozambique.
Bosnia has been a testing ground for many UN policies, but what have we learned? One lesson, economic sanctions, one of the UN's main weapons, is a big gun that can backfire. Here again is Christian Amanpour.
These factory workers in Belgrade are under attack. They're trying to survive an all-out assault waged by the United Nations against Yugoslavia. It's a non-violent assault. UN members are banned from doing business with Yugoslavia. Economic sanctions. It's meant to cripple the economy.
Nobody's punished but the workers and the people, not the politicians, not anybody else but the people. It's all on the back of the little guy.
The UN imposed the sanctions in 1992 to force Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, the most powerful politician in Yugoslavia, to stop helping the Bosnian Serbs and to encourage him to help end the war in Bosnia. Here at the UN, sanctions are being touted as the weapon of the future because member states are increasingly reluctant to use military force. Though sanctions can be effective, they are also controversial because they hurt ordinary people and often undermine other UN goals. In theory, sanctions are supposed to make life so difficult for the average person that the government gives in to the UN. In reality, they can backfire. In Yugoslavia, the sanctions have ruined an already ailing economy, but they've also played into the hands of its leaders. At this farm machinery factory, production is down 70% because it can't export its products. Wages have been slashed as much as 90%.
I'm a metal worker, and I could say that before these sanctions, I was able to live a good life. Now it's harder and harder, and I'm always looking for side jobs, in the afternoons, on Saturdays and Sundays. I have a wife and 3 kids, and I can't survive on what I make here.
We've had to cut way back on food. As for shopping, we can't buy anything for the house, and with school starting, we can't even buy anything for the kids. In the winter, we won't be able to afford our utility bills either. Could anybody survive on what I make?
In spite of the suffering, the people of Yugoslavia have not rebelled against the Milosevic government. In fact, 7 months after the sanctions were imposed, Milosevic was re-elected. And experts say he has even used the sanctions to his advantage, blaming them for the hardship rather than his government's own failed economic policies.
We shouldn't blame our government for this situation, because no matter what our government does, the international community is against us.
The irony for the UN, its sanctions have reinforced the same nationalism that led to the breakup of Yugoslavia and the war in Bosnia. When you hammer steel, you make it harder.
Before I was proud. Now I'm even more proud, because I think that you should be proud and should be a real Serb, especially when there is a big injustice against us. I think of myself as more of a Serb than I was, especially in such difficult times. We're the kind of people who endure.
Zoran Popovic, a mining engineer now working as a security guard at the factory, says he too is proud to be a Serb. But he's joining an exodus of middle-class professionals, the backbone of Yugoslavia's economy, leaving for a better life in the West.
There is a great possibility to better life, because I want to make a better future for my baby, for my boy, and for my wife also. I don't want to worry like here.
For the UN, the brain drain is an unwanted side effect. When sanctions are eventually lifted, the absence of a strong middle class will make it difficult to rebuild Yugoslavia's economy and complete its transition from communism. The sanctions also hit Yugoslavia's neighbors as they too tried to create free market economies. The former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, now independent, is particularly vulnerable.
When you compare the daily life in Serbia with the daily life and the struggle here in this country, then you could wonder yourself, what is going on? Are the wrong people being punished for the sanctions?
To preserve what's left of Macedonia's fragile economy, its government has been reluctant to enforce the UN's trade ban, even with a team of international monitors at the border. And because the UN didn't give the monitors the authority to seize illegal shipments, they're getting through.
We're limited by the goodwill of the Macedonian customs, really. If they choose to allow us to examine a consignment, then we can.
So they only inspect 20% of the trucks.
Everything that's necessary to keep a country survive is being transported. I can't even call it smuggling, it's transported to Serbia. You see everything, foodstuffs, chemicals, everything, machinery.
And fuel, the lifeblood of any economy. Mule trains smuggle it through the mountains into Yugoslavia. And along this dusty back road near the border, 3 new gas stations have popped up within the last year.
We think it's one of the ways the oil is going into Serbia. Either by tanker trucks that are being refilled at night, or perhaps some way of a pipeline going into Serbia.
The bottom line is, do economic sanctions work?
Good to see you again.
Serbian President Milosevic has entered peace negotiations and publicly renounced military support for the Bosnian Serbs, but some support continues. Remember Scott O'Grady, the American pilot shot down over Bosnia last June? U.S. intelligence says the radar used to track his plane is controlled not in Bosnia, but in Yugoslavia, the very country sanctions were meant to bring in line. So if economic sanctions are not a perfect weapon, are they the UN's best weapon for the future, short of war?
Come on, let's go.
When CNN Presents continues, the United Nations under attack in Bosnia and in the United States.
We will vow that American foreign policies will be determined by us, not by the United Nations.
This special CNN Presents, the next 50 years, the UN at war and peace will continue.
Within the United Nations, the country with the most clout is the United States. The U.S. was the most powerful force in creating the UN and has been its biggest financial backer. But the UN's troubles in Bosnia have taken a toll on American public opinion about the UN, with serious implications for the future of the world body. Christiane Amanpour continues our report.
Come on, let's go.
UN peacekeepers in the former Yugoslavia have sustained more than 1,500 casualties. 200 of them have been killed. Sometimes caught in the crossfire, sometimes deliberately targeted. Corporal Stephen Stott, a British soldier, had been in Bosnia for 3 weeks when one night the building that housed his unit was hit by an artillery round.
I opened my sleeping bag to stand up and I couldn't get up. And I looked down and my right foot was actually twisted the other way around. So I was looking at the bottom of my foot. Right, this is an actual piece of shrapnel that they took out.
Shrapnel destroyed several inches of bone. Stott considers it lucky that doctors saved his leg. But he believes he was hurt needlessly because he thinks the UN mission lacked clear goals.
You're either fighting or you're not fighting. You're either peacekeeping or you're not peacekeeping. You can't do both.
There have been more UN casualties in Bosnia than in any other peacekeeping mission. Though there aren't any Americans on the ground yet, casualties and body bags are political dynamite in the United States. There, conservative politicians are launching their own assault against the UN. With their sights set on the White House, 3 Republican candidates used their announcement speeches to attack the United Nations.
Our birthright of sovereignty, purchased with the blood of patriots, is being traded away for foreign money, handed over to faceless foreign bureaucrats at places like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the UN.
And I will never send American troops into combat under UN command.
And when we take our revolution to the White House in 1996, we will vow that American foreign policies will be determined by us, not by the United Nations.
UN bashers may attract conservative votes in a Republican primary, but supporters say it's inaccurate and unfair to accuse the UN of pushing the US around.
It's, in many cases, cheap shots, where they are looking at an international organization as if it were some kind of an alien body, when the bottom line is it is an organization that is composed of its constituent parts. The UN does not do things that its member states don't want it to do.
A large majority of Americans say they support the UN, but they increasingly see it as ineffective. In 1990, a few months before the Gulf War, 54% of Americans surveyed in a Gallup poll said the UN was doing a good job. But by this summer, after years of fumbling in Bosnia, 56% said the UN was doing a poor job.
You see, if you just picked one element and say you have not been successful in you have a setback in Sarajevo or you have a setback in Mogadishu, and because of this the United Nations fails, it is an oversimplification. Sarajevo setback, and I don't want to underestimate neither Sarajevo nor Mogadishu, represent 5% of the whole activities of the United Nations. This today, and if you just put this in the last 50 years, or the next 50 years, it will represent 0.1%.
May I invite the leaders of delegations.
50 years ago, when the UN was created through the leadership of Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, it was sold to the American public in idealistic terms, appealing rhetoric after the fight against fascism in World War II.
To create an enduring peace under the guidance of God.
But isolationists always feared the UN was a step towards world government. During the Cold War, conservatives tolerated it as a forum for confronting the Soviet Union.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no?
But the Cold War is over, and a sea change has swept American politics.
Our new speaker, the gentleman from Georgia, Newt Gingrich.
When the 104th Congress was sworn in, Republicans had taken control.
There is now, for the first time really in 50 years,
a concerted and powerful and now dominant source of opposition and criticism to the United Nations.
The Republicans' contract with America and other legislative bombs hit the UN hard. Proposed cuts in U.S. dues to the UN, cuts in the UN's social and economic programs, and cuts in money for peacekeeping. The United States already owes the UN more than $1 billion in unpaid dues. President Clinton calls the cuts part of an isolationist backlash.
When our vital interests are at stake, of course we might have to act alone. But we need the wisdom to work with the United Nations and to pay our bills.
A large majority of the U.S. public supports American membership in the UN. But according to public opinion polls, that support appears to be softening. According to a Roper poll, in 1991, 64% strongly favored U.S. membership in the UN. In 1995, only 37% felt strongly about it. Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali says dropping out of the UN is a luxury America can't afford.
The United States will be confronted by a new global problem who cannot be solved but by the United Nations. Transnational crime, drugs, immigration, environment, all those problems, the multiplicity of war all over the world. The United States is not ready to play the role of the policeman of the world. And this role can be played for the time being only by the United Nations.
Even as 185 member nations celebrate 50 UN years, calls for reform remain high on the agenda. Everyone agrees, cut waste, stop fraud, trim the bureaucracy. But at the heart of the issue lies the future of the United Nations. As a senior U.S. diplomat says, a world organization without the leadership of the United States is like playing baseball without a bat.
The end of the Cold War began a new era of action for the United Nations. More peacekeepers sent on more missions than any other period in the UN history. Bosnia was an acid test. Can peacekeepers go where there's no peace to keep? How can the UN rescue refugees when that helps ethnic cleansing? And can the UN prosecute crimes against humanity? Bosnia's questions will demand answers for the UN's next 50 years. When we continue this special CNN Presents, we'll see another side of the United Nations, the UN at peace, jump-starting one of the poorest countries in the world.
The United Nations is much more than peacekeeping.
It really has a very proud record in eradicating disease, in feeding hungry people around the world.
To do something about the immunization of children, to do something about women all over the world.
The UN has to be a strong force for peace, and it has to be a strong force for development. And it can't be one without the other.
This week, CNN presents The Next 50 Years, the UN at War and Peace.
It is one of the poorest countries on the planet, a nation robbed by 20 years of civil war. Now a nation the United Nations is helping to rise from its own ashes. I'm Bernard Shaw. Welcome back to this special 2-hour CNN Presents, The Next 50 Years, the UN at War and Peace. Just 3 years ago, Mozambique was a bitter battleground. Socialist troops fighting the rebels armed by the racist South African regime. Now, a different battle, a United Nations struggle to help the people of Mozambique down the bumpy road to peace, a road still littered with deadly reminders of war. CNN's Mike Hanna continues our look at lessons for the UN's next 50 years.
Now, the machine is kind of crying because it has found the metal.
Peter Fernandez is looking for landmines, more than 1 million of them, scattered like lethal petals throughout the Mozambican countryside.
If you hear sound, you gotta dig it, otherwise we might hit in a mine. besides it, and suddenly, boom, you're gone. Like they say goodbye, Bruce Lee.
The mines, which cost less than 50 cents to lay, cost as much as $4,000 each to remove. They are destroyed where they are found.
It's kind of funny. See a mine going up, boom, and you get satisfied.
One more gone.
Yeah, one more gone, and minus one death. I should say that.
Demining here and around the developing world is one of the UN's most difficult and dangerous missions. Globally, it will cost an estimated $58 million to remove these inexpensive weapons of terror. The mines here were laid in the war by government troops, but there are thousands more that were set by rebels backed by the white regime in neighboring South Africa. For nearly 2 decades, Mozambique was in the grip of a ferocious civil war. Government and rebel forces waged a bitter struggle that tore the nation apart, driving more than 4 million people from their homes. 3 years ago, a ceasefire, and the United Nations began a massive repatriation and reconstruction program. The refugees came back to a country finally at peace. The UN agencies provided food and shelter. Mass starvation was averted. And 1 year ago, democratic elections set the seal on the peace process, bringing to power President Joaquim Chissano, who's quick to praise United Nations peacemakers.
We needed to have an organization or a third party which could inspire mutual confidence between the two sides.
When the UN Blue Helmets came to Mozambique, Afonso Dhlakama was still leading his rebels in the bush. Today, he says, the UN peacemakers were vital in persuading the warriors to lay down their arms.
But if people in the ground, they don't like peace, my friend, I'm not prepared to cheat you. They cannot do that.
Now soldiers who once fought each other are clearing mines together, united in their struggle against a common enemy that knows no ceasefire or peace accord. Each corridor of tape defines days of painstaking and dangerous work. Each meter cleared represents a victory. The bulk of the United Nations contingent in Mozambique has finished its work and gone. But the job of those left behind has only just begun. There are as many as 2,000 areas like this still waiting to be demined, seemingly innocuous expanses of bush that are in fact death traps. No trains travel on these tracks, and at the end of the line, a factory that once produced much of the country's cement stands silent. The mines planted to protect the quarry from attack now keep workers away, and the cement so desperately needed to rebuild roads, bridges and homes has to be imported at crippling cost. In the village of Moamba, a memorial to those who died in battle, but all around are far more tangible reminders of the war. On the outskirts, empty houses in untilled fields signal that this is a danger zone. A minefield 75 kilometers long encircles the town.
What's happened now, because of the mine ring, is very difficult for themselves to move out to the agriculture fields and to the bypass ways to go to Sabia or into Moamba. And what we open here is big gates on the mine ring.
For all too many, the demining work of the United Nations has come too late. William Shongo is just one of the thousands of landmine victims whose ability to provide for his family has been lost along with his leg.
I was just going to cut the wooden poles to build my hut in a place near the electricity pylons. I stepped on the mine and it cut off my leg and hurt my hand.
His wife, Nora Svunza, is now the sole breadwinner in a family of 7.
In the beginning, when they started laying the mines, we were happy because they were saving us from the enemy. But after the war, instead of saving us, they've been killing us. So we've been afraid.
I feel that after the mines have been removed, my life will be all right because I'll move about freely without fear and I'll be able to do what I have to do to survive.
To move freely without fear, part of the UN's broad mandate to provide collective security, is a right still denied the people of Moamba. The peace train has not yet arrived at the station. The power games played by faraway bureaucrats in a Manhattan skyscraper delayed the mine clearing.
Whoever has control of mine clearance controls a very large budget and gives them tremendous influence. And the result was in Mozambique that you had faction fighting between different UN agencies who wanted to control the mine clearance operation. That resulted in New York in a delay in signing of contracts for mine clearance, which in turn therefore resulted in a stagnation on the ground.
What we've done here, what we've learned here, is that after the Civil War, after the peace process, you must establish close liaison with the government, get their approval to do what it is you want to do, get them involved in the process, get them to set the priorities, and get them to make the decisions.
Mozambicans are now making their own decisions with the support of the United Nations. The deployment of this prototype mine-clearing vehicle is yet another sign that the voices of those in Moamba have finally been heard in Manhattan. Another mine destroyed. And among best friends who've suffered most, a sense of hope restored.
I really feel happy that they've started to remove the mines, because I know many people will be safer. There'll be fewer people hurt, as I was.
I will be very happy as an African if the mines get to be removed, because our life is in the bush. That's how we survive. We work there, we till the fields, we gather our food. With the mines, we cannot do anything.
And for all those who live here, the knowledge that one day the children can safely play.
I'm very concerned when my child goes out to play and leaves home. I know that there are mines all around, and many times when he doesn't come, I get very worried because I don't know what may have happened to him.
It may be little consolation for a worried mother, but UN officials are thankful for any success. So far, Mozambique represents a victory.
For once, we have one case that is working well. For once, one mission has been extremely successful, not only in implementing a peace agreement, but in creating the base for a real democracy, which is going on in Mozambique at this stage.
What is going on in Mozambique is a hard lesson. But from the dust and suffering comes a vision of a kinder future for a reborn nation and for the battered world organization that came to help.
When CNN Presents continues, children's lives in the balance. Can UN health programs heal the deep wounds of war?
A marriage that the bridal pair hope will grow like the tree. In Moamba village, the community comes together to celebrate a wedding, to seal the union between two people committed to facing the future together. But among those here, the sense of a greater unity. The divisions created by years of war have ended. Once bitter enemies have made vows of peace in a marriage largely brokered by the United Nations. For the offspring, hopes of a better future. In Mozambique, 1 out of every 3 children die before the age of 5. A mortality rate unthinkable in a world that professes to value life. But now the scales of existence are increasingly weighted towards survival. Chileta Seta's baby has malaria, and the doctor explains carefully what treatment is needed. One more child has a chance of survival that in past years would most likely have been denied. What would you do if there was no hospital to bring the baby to?
I'd go to the witch doctor. He's the only one who could help.
Dr. George Vicente sees as many as 60 patients a day. Here he deals with yet another emergency. A woman 8 months pregnant, suffering from an advanced bout of malaria that has brought her to the verge of death. Immediate treatment stabilizes her condition, and yet another life has been saved at Muamba Hospital.
During the war, there were only 2 round huts and the building that's behind them. Now the war has stopped, people have got peace, they've got nice buildings, they have doctors, nurses, everything. But we Mozambicans still cannot afford to do things ourselves. We need a hand from the United Nations for the next 5 years, and after that we will keep on by ourselves.
5 years that a still suffering people need.
Development is a marathon. I think we all realize that. There are no quick fixes. There may be quick fixes, but they are not sustainable. They won't last.
That's a lesson learned by the United Nations and by Mozambican health professionals the World Organization is helping to train. Development takes time.
We had to work. There was no other way. There were the problems to be solved. So we had to coordinate. We had to find a way together with the United Nations agents.
Dance therapy in a hospital for the insane. This refurbished facility is evidence that a way has been found to address the needs of all. That coordination between the UN and the country's people has forged harmony out of the discord of war. The major health problems here are those of poverty. Cholera, typhoid, pneumonia, malaria, diseases that are curable or preventable, in Mozambique become fatal. But what the United Nations has found is that diseases that kill can also unite. Sickness has no political allegiance. And those who came to help were clearly identified as neutral. Members of the UN family and other aid organizations traveled to even the most remote areas of Mozambique, bringing with the food and medical care a message of peace. A sparkling signal that those who'd suffered apart could now be healed together.
What is very important here, UN didn't fight with the gun. We fight it with the dialogue, and we push the people to reconciliation.
Reconciliation is more than just a word. At food distribution centers in the bush, the combatants and the millions who were caught in the crossfire come together. Many are not yet able to feed themselves, but their needs for peace and security are finally being met. In the villages along the Zambezi River, the ravages of war are still evident, but newly risen amidst the destruction is yet another hospital, a building that stands as more than just a symbol of health.
The fact that you come to the facility in need of this service that it's providing, and you are getting it, makes you realize that, there is no kind of favoritism or discrimination against yourself or against the other person. That in itself, I think, cements the feeling of belonging to one nation, I think.
A country that was once terminally ill is beginning to heal. Helped by the outside world, the people of Mozambique are beginning to help themselves. And the United Nations now has a positive model of healthcare and reconstruction on which future missions can be based. Johan and Elias Nguge have come home. Refugee twins born in a neighboring country. They were brought back 5 months ago by their mother, Celestina. The children are hungry because we cannot plant crops, she says. But I'm happy that at least they can get food and medicine here. Some who would die will now live. It's a quick fix, like so many things the United Nations does in war and peace. The peace, at least, has lasted 3 years. The good health of Mozambique will take much longer. So how will the world body know it has achieved success? When Johan and Elias are able to fill the stomachs of their children without the UN's help.
Still ahead on CNN Presents, helping Mozambique navigate rough economic times. How can the UN keep the country afloat without making it dependent on an outside lifeline?
The United Nations knows that peace in the world's poorest country will never last unless the poor get help. So the UN plans to pump billions of dollars into Mozambique, trying to revive an economy strangled by decades of Marxist rule. But there's danger, even in good deeds. Will all that world money actually help Mozambique stand on its feet? Or will this country be left clinging to an international lifeline? Once again, CNN's Mike Hanna.
More than 60% of the population live in absolute poverty. An average annual income of $80 per person. An inflation rate exceeding 50%. These statistics are the legacy of war and the inheritance of a Marxist economy in which the needs of the individual were subordinate to those of the state. But now the people of Mozambique are poised to reap the rich harvest of peace. Along the country's extensive coastline, fishermen coming to shore with their catch signal the emergence of an economy no longer floundering in Marxist dogma. This is just part of what could be the most important harvest of all. Mozambique produces well over 100,000 tons of fish each year, worth more than $120 million. These small boats represent the promise of better things to come. Flickering here the hope that after 2 decades of rigid state control, a new and vibrant economy could emerge. That a country at present receiving 3/4 of its income in international aid may in the future become self-sufficient.
I think the fishery sector is one of the best organized sectors in the Mozambican economy. It provides about 40 to 50% of the foreign currency. So it is very, very important.
Gustavo Miranda is part of the ongoing UN operation in Mozambique. His primary task is to help smooth the path of development, to assist the government in creating conditions most conducive to its program of abandoning economic control.
You see, when the state gives up being an entrepreneur and it gives the private initiative this initiative, the point is how to make a proper environment, how to create conditions to make the private companies well managed and profitable.
Angelo Corella bought his own trawler 5 years ago, one of the first to benefit when the government made good its promise to embark on a program of privatization. Now he hopes investors from other countries will also come aboard.
They will help us create more employment. And this is the biggest problem on this country. A lot of people, they don't have work.
Angelo Corella has found success and profit. But tens of thousands of others in the fishing industry still battle to survive. The will to work is clearly there. Along the coast, the catch is painstakingly brought in by hand. Hours of back-breaking work with increasingly pitiful return as the shoals of fish grow smaller. In a canning factory owned by the government, gleaming machinery stands silent. The facility is for sale, but nobody is willing to buy. 85% of the Mozambican workforce is unemployed. Millions of people can do nothing but wait for the opportunity to begin to support themselves. The newly refurbished port of Beira, where more than $1 billion worth of goods are handled each year. Exports account for a mere 10% of the total, a figure that clearly demonstrates the desperate state of the country's economy. But the process of development has to begin in even the smallest of ways. In this shrimp processing plant, packers taught new skills by a UN agency are finally receiving wages. At the same time, their training makes the produce more desirable in an increasingly competitive export market.
To develop, we must think in terms of wider markets, and for that, a high standard of quality is essential.
Higher quality, greater exports, more profit, a larger number of people employed. This is a cycle that at this stage of their development, the Mozambicans are unable to sustain alone. Aid produces dependence, and the question the UN has to decide is when has it done enough?
They're really trying to liberalize their economy and get it going on a new footing. This takes some time. The catch here is that aid should decline, but it can't happen too fast. We can't pull out in such a way that we jeopardize a lot of the very, very good things that are happening.
Throughout Mozambique, the roads and bridges are being rebuilt. The links between communities are being repaired. And the lines of local trade that traditionally form the basis of the economy are being reopened. Left untouched by the war is the iron will of the people to survive. And the government says it's these people who will best know the point at which the UN should reduce its help.
They discovered little by little that we knew what we were standing for, and that we could lead the process and ask them the help which was required. And therefore they started listening.
We should learn to listen more, and we should accept, and this sounds a little heavy, but we should accept that people seem to be able to know much better what they want and what they can do than we often think.
And this, many in the United Nations now agree, was the most important lesson learnt in Mozambique. That the people should be the architects of their own future. That they are the best judges of their own needs.
We have this feeling that we have to think for them and we have to find the solutions. Instead of trying to take a little more time, be a little more patient and try to find out what they really want.
What the people clearly wanted was peace. A peace the UN knows cannot last without economic stability. It's a shimmering promise that has yet to be fully realized.
Coming up on CNN Presents, Mozambique's hidden resource, women. Can the UN help change an ancient culture?
In the soft light of evening, the hard work continues. As the tide goes out, the women come down to the water to shrimp. In the harsh midday sun, the women sort the corn. The women take the corn to the mill. and then carry the sacks to the home or market. It's a long cycle of labor that never seems to end. And always there are the children to care for. In the past, Mozambican women did not figure in the equation of power. They had little say in a system controlled by males. But when, in long years of war, the bulk of men took up arms or were driven to find work in neighboring states, the balance began to shift. And now reflected in the tranquility of peace, a different society. One in which the women are beginning to lead rather than follow. More than half the population here is female. 8 million people who ultimately constitute this country's most vital resource. To improve the lives of the women of Mozambique is to develop the nation.
A long time ago, women were merely looked upon as instruments for menial work. But now women can argue, they can give their opinions, they can earn money for the family.
Adelaide Alfea is intent on changing lives. She's part of a system unique to Mozambique. More than 100 women's centres, or green zones, spread throughout the country. Part of the funding comes from the United Nations, and an increasing amount is being raised by the women themselves.
The objective of the center is to become self-sufficient. When UNICEF leaves, the center wants to be able to stand on its own. When we teach one woman, we teach many, because she will teach others whatever she's been taught.
Here, women learn new skills. Some are making clothes for their family to wear. Others, more advanced, are making garments for sale, for the income that will continue to keep the center alive. And most important, in a society where an estimated 60% of people are illiterate, the opportunity to learn to read and write. This lies at the heart of the green zones, the provision of a basic education that in past years was a luxury.
As férias foram boas? Não foram muito boas.
Next door, the children are at work. Daycare facilities are essential if the women are to find the time to learn. And here in the green zone, the young will probably never know the extent to which their mothers were denied.
Kids think they have all the time in the world to learn, but adults know that this is their only time. So the adults want to learn everything. That's why they are more interested in learning than the young kids.
38-year-old Masuruka Fabiao is one of the thousands of Green Zone graduates. In the past 6 years, she's learned how to tend and market her chickens. She's learned how to sew and how to make cough mixture from herbs. She has also learned how to read and write, given a voice after so many years of silence, and above all, she's been given a sense of worth.
It's important for women to feel proud of themselves. There's so many things we can do. We just did not realize it.
And here there is the beginning of a process, a cycle of change that once underway achieves a momentum and a power all of its own.
The lives of my children have improved because of what I've learned here. I've taken what I've learned and I've gone home and taught it to them. I want my daughters to go to school, continue their education, so they can be whatever they want to be. I've learned that women can do whatever men do, and that is good.
It's a lesson learnt as well by Yolanda Musa. She's the editor of a women's magazine. Like her sisters in the green zones, she receives vital support from the United Nations.
We are creating a new society in Mozambique, and it's my feeling that we need all kind of support. technical support, financial support, institutional support, and I think that UN can help us in those areas. We have to consolidate our peace, and for the consolidation of peace, we need the support of UN.
And Yolanda Musa believes that support for women serves also to transform the lives of the men.
We can't look ourselves, women, as an island in a society. We are living with the men, and we have to educate the men in order to struggle with us.
In a green zone, the UN helped create people on the very cusp of change sing a song of joy. Music that is increasingly being heard throughout this shattered land. The women of Mozambique are set on a path of fundamental change. The load they carried alone for so long now being shared, not only with the men who've returned from war, but also with a world body that in this nation has truly been seen to care.
When CNN Presents continues, critics call it a failure. Supporters call it the best solution for global problems. Is the UN up to the next 50 years?
It has failed dismally. It has succeeded beyond the dreams of many. But what of the future of the UN? Does the world body need a makeover for the 21st century? Reformers say yes. World problems may be growing faster and more fierce than the UN was ever built to solve. After all, it was created to answer the difficult global questions of 1945, not 1995. The debate is passionate. Can the UN become a better world problem solver, a stronger planetary police force, a more powerful agency for world justice? Or for many in this often disunited nations, the key question, should it?
What we're trying to do, the United States agenda #1, is to streamline the UN and make it more effective for the 21st century.
Everyone in the UN agrees that it's time for reform and renewal. Every good government, every corporation goes through that periodically, and that is now happening.
And part of that should be a tightening, a reducing the size of the UN so that it will be more efficient.
This allegation that the United Nations is a behemoth of waste is at most only a slight overstatement. It certainly is a very corrupt, oversized bureaucracy.
There are problems at the United Nations because member governments don't cooperate adequately to permit the United Nations to work, not because there's a large bureaucracy.
It is not, in terms of an institution of government or governance, a behemoth of waste. There are more people employed at Disneyland than there are in the United Nations system.
I don't know of any other organization in the world that is asked to do so much with so little. You remember, of course, that the United Nations is much more than peacekeeping.
It really has a very proud record in a number of areas, in controlling international air traffic, in eradicating disease. In feeding hungry people around the world.
And humanitarian affairs and human rights and environmental action and family planning.
So we get a pretty good deal out of the United Nations. You know, people think it costs a ton of money. Do you know what the UN really costs? It costs $7 per American, from all the way from the job that it does vaccinating children to the blue helmets. That is the cost of one movie ticket. Now, there may be a little waste, but it's about 25 cents worth of the $7. But $7 is not a lot of money to make sure that we can continue to exist in this planet.
I think the Security Council cannot continue to have a veto for 5 permanent member states and then a representation which does not reflect even the realities of power as they have emerged over the last 50 years.
Well, we clearly are not going to give up the American veto. I think that is very important for the United States, and it clearly is for the other permanent members.
The current structure, by and large, reflects the power structure of 1945. The world has changed, and we have to bring it in line.
You know that we have now 185 member states, but only 15 on Security Council. So that is a very small group, taking very large decisions on behalf of the others.
We have to make the Security Council more inclusive. It needs to have representation from countries that have changed dramatically since 50 years ago. The Security Council should reflect, for instance, the fact that two outlaw nations, when the UN was formed, Germany and Japan, are now major powers in the world and a large part of our global cooperation.
"95% of the new babies were born in the third world last year. They are the generation of the 21st century. Now, if they are not given even a role in the decision-making in the Security Council, then either the Security Council will become irrelevant or it will have to change fundamentally.
But we also think it's very important to have an effective Security Council.
And it's criticized now for not being able to take on a range of activities. You make it bigger, you'll make it less effective.
Threats to global human security are real, and they are deadly.
The danger of broadening the definition of collective security is that it becomes so unfocused that it simply becomes an excuse for bureaucratic intrusion everywhere. And I think that's a rather serious danger.
I think it is being recognized that 80% of the people who die in the United States today die from causes which arise far from their shores. Drugs from somewhere, HIV/AIDS from somewhere. They travel without a passport across international frontiers.
The spread of poverty, massive population increases, continuing environmental decay, the spread of diseases.
And I think it's only a matter of time that nations will realize that their security is global and indivisible. And once that recognition comes, probably they will be supporting some such forum as an Economic Security Council.
To do something about the immunization of children, to do something about housing, to do something about women all over the world.
All of these things are huge world problems. They demand a world institution that is looking after them on a constant basis, just as the Security Council looks after international aggression and security issues. We don't have that today.
The U.S. should have its feet held to the fire.
Other countries are extremely upset about the financial crisis in which our failure to pay our bills has placed the UN.
It has seriously hindered the United Nations. It has put it at the brink of bankruptcy.
We need to figure out a way to pay the dues and the bills, and we believe that we have that obligation, and we're trying to persuade the Congress that that is in America's national interest.
There are some creative ideas afloat for how UN can find additional or outside funding, such as an assessment or tax on international commercial transactions, or a few dollars tax on international air flights, or on international air mail.
You could tax satellite parking places up in space. You could tax sea lanes.
My all-time favorite, but I think the least compelling, is to permit gambling in the first-class cabin of airplanes and to use the proceeds to fund international organizations.
Ideas like an international airline tax or a tax on international financial transactions are about as likely to make up the UN's budget as the sale of Girl Scout cookies.
Under no circumstances whatsoever should the United Nations be given a taxing authority, even a limited one. We have seen through hard experience in this country how a limited tax represents just a foot in the door.
This is a point of of redefinition. A turning point, a defining moment for the next half-century.
It's an organization that we cannot do without. And if we are going to strengthen it, I think we should make it truly the organization of we, the people.
I wouldn't exactly cry buckets of tears if the UN went out of business.
The UN has to be a strong force for peace, and it has to be a strong force for development. And it can't be one without the other. We'll never secure peace in the world without development. We'll never secure development in the world without peace.
So the 21st century, on the one hand, focuses on peacekeeping and peacemaking and rescues the lives of those, particularly children, that are warped, distorted, and destroyed. And on the other hand, it says, why the devil do you have an international body if you can't bring a decent measure of economic security to this world? And that's where the UN sees its fruition from the foundation in '45.
The United Nations turns 50 years old this month. Time for celebration. Beneath the pomp is serious purpose. For UN lovers and haters, reformers and exploiters, it remains the only place where every nation on earth can gather to talk and sometimes, yes, sometimes even resolve the differences that divide and prepare together for the challenges of the next 50 years. Here's a look at our next CNN Presents.
A work of fiction that some consider a blueprint for terrorism.
I think there's little doubt that McVeigh was simply copycatting the fictional bombing in the Turner Diaries.
A talk show that's spreading its anti-government message tax-free.
Bill Clinton is a criminal because Bill Clinton knows exactly what he's doing.
Businesses that thrive on fear.
Of course, we have customers that are preparing for Armageddon and World War III, too.
When we return next week, CNN presents Patriots and Prophets.